Hello, friends, and welcome to my free offering for the One Heart, One Earth Summit. Thank you so much for going through the summit, for being a part of, I think, this incredible time of healing and this incredible time of awakening for all of us. One of the reasons I wanted to provide this particular seminar as a free offering for you is I really do believe that we are in creating a new earth, we also need to leave room for the folks who have endured trauma in our lives. Those of us who work in human services or in the nonprofit world serving folks who are vulnerable, we already know this. We already know a lot of these tactics, and one of the things that would make our lives easier as helpers and light workers is other people understanding this as well. So this is all I'm trying to do, just give some basics, regardless of what industry you work in, what life you lead for yourself. I do think we need to all be better at taking care of one another. So this is my attempt to do that. For those of you who did not watch my sessions in the summit, either in May or in June, a little introduction to me. I am a social justice attorney. My name is Janet Rose, and I am a social justice attorney, heart-centered mentor, and visionary leader. I was born and raised in Pueblo, Colorado, and based my work in Denver, Colorado, although I do work throughout the United States. I primarily have focused on serving those who are most vulnerable and the folks who probably have been the most invisible in a lot of the different processes that we are trying to create out in the world right now. So I want to be sure that we are not leaving people behind. I've worked in nonprofit, I've worked in government, I've worked as a lobbyist, I've been a mediator, I've been an attorney, I've been a disability attorney, I've been an advocate. Really, my whole career has spanned what it means to help others. So I hope that you find this presentation useful, and I'll have information at the end of this on how you can contact me if you want more information, if you want a training like this for your folks that is a lot more specific to your industry and the work that you do. I'm very happy to do that. So right now, let's just launch into it. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. And then let's see if I can get into the actual slideshow so that you don't have to watch me the whole time. All right. There we go. Oh, look, there's my photo. So this is called Trauma-Informed Care to Support a New Earth. And this is part of the One Heart, One Earth Summit. Thank you again for joining. All right, we're just going to launch into this. The 4 R's of trauma-informed care, this comes directly from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. They provide a lot of guidance and funding and grants and research to support folks doing mental health, behavioral health, and substance abuse counseling. And in particular, they look at how to integrate this into our healthcare system. And then I personally look at this on how we can integrate this into public policy and social policy a lot more, and our social contracts. So the 4 R's of trauma-informed care really, and what we're going to go through today, is realizing the widespread impact of trauma around us, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in ourselves and others, responding by integrating trauma-informed practices in our lives, and then resisting re-traumatization of ourselves and of others. All right. So the first part, realizing the widespread impact of trauma, is really, like I could spend a whole hour just on this alone about why trauma matters, but let's look into it a little bit deeper. What is trauma on its surface? There's a lot of different definitions in there. American Psychological Association has theirs. American Medical Association, I believe, has their own, but this is the one that I've come up with based off of all of these different definitions that we see out in the world. Trauma results from exposure to an incident or a series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening. It overwhelms the person's capacity to cope, and it threatens their sense of safety, security, and bodily autonomy. And that response can be physical, emotional, spiritual, psychic, There's all sorts of different levels that this can be experienced. Finally, it can have a lasting adverse effect on the individual's functioning and their mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. So that's really important because it's not just one type of event. It's not just one type of reaction. It's not just one type of impact. All of these things come together in a very, very individual way. So we're going to go over that one more time. It's exposure to an event. So sometimes in this world, we'll talk about things like big T trauma and small t trauma. And the only reason why we talk about it that way is because there are people out in the world who will say, well, that's not real trauma. A real great example is I recently had surgery. In it, I was talking to the anesthesiologist right before the surgery, and I mentioned that I am a survivor of sexual trauma. And he said, oh, good, it wasn't real trauma. So that to me already, like coming from an anesthesiologist, that is already someone who's trying to distinguish between what they view as a big T trauma and a small t trauma. Small t here, I am talking about chronic, persistent, or ongoing, but we have a whole level of people, even in that big T trauma area, which are things like the single incident events or the limited instance. So one instance of sexual assault, one instance of a really severe car accident or combat, a specific instance of combat. Those are things that we're going to view as big T trauma. We're going to view that as authentic trauma. And I'm using air quotes very, very specifically here because any event that has this impact is relevant. And so sometimes we tend to also ignore that ongoing persistent trauma. Things like racism and the traumatic everyday effect that has, where it puts someone in that realm of an overwhelm. Their body is overwhelmed and unable to fully cope and move forward. So these things can have a cumulative effect or they can have a single instance effect. It really doesn't matter. That's actually kind of the point. The next part is that it's about that person's own experience. So multiple people can experience the same event differently. You and I can get into a car accident together and I could walk away from it saying, whew, that that was like normal every day for me, man, and not feel a thing. And you could then be so traumatized by that event that you have trouble getting into a car without hyperventilating after that. There is no illegitimate response to trauma. It really is about that person's own experience because each of us are bringing in our own background, our own experience, our own learning, our own training, our own cultural norms into every single experience that we have as human beings. And me, by virtue of who I am and how I grew up, I am going to experience a very similar event differently than you. And so just because you did not have a traumatic reaction to something, say a sexual assault, although that's a really big thing, it could be that the person next to you who went through the exact same thing had a very traumatic effect. So it really doesn't matter what the severity of the exposure was, what the experience of the exposure was. If they experienced it as traumatic, that's what matters. And finally, this has a lasting adverse effect. All of us, when we go through something very stressful and difficult, it might affect us for a day or two. But what we're talking about persistent trauma responses where the body is activated in that stress hormone cocktail all day long or all week long or all month long or for the last 5 years with very few breaks in between. And it could have, you could have those breaks, but the problem is that a lot of times I think we're waiting for people to have an extreme reaction. And what it tends to be is a little bit of an undercurrent that is just constantly activated by these very normal situations that we often find ourselves in. So for example, when I actually viewed being on public benefits. A long time ago, I lost my job. My husband lost his job. We had to apply for food stamps and Medicaid. And I have no shame in admitting that, because those were two very wonderful programs that helped us get back on our feet. So, but I will say, walking into the building, having them constantly lose my application and my application materials and going in over and over and over again, I actually started to have a visceral reaction to that building, and I started to really avoid that building, which was very funny, because later on, when I actually started doing some of this trauma-informed care work, I was actually working in that same building where I had applied for benefits and felt that traumatic reaction. So even being in that building, even though I was not being actively traumatized at that time, there was something about that building that reminded me of this really difficult time in my life and made me feel exactly the same way that I felt while I was going through that, albeit not as activated on this higher level and more of this undercurrent throughout my life. All right. One note that I want to make is about historic, intergenerational, and cultural trauma. Um, because this tends to get lumped into that small t trauma space. And the reason I wanted to bring it up today in particular is that this is what we're seeing with Black Lives Matter. This is what we're seeing with Me Too. This is what we are seeing with all of these very big movements that are saying, hey, this has been going on way too long. It has impacted not just me, but all the people like me. Sorry, there's something that just flew out of my hand. So it is, we are starting to see some research coming out right now, and we're still in the infancy, or I'd say toddler land of learning about how the brain works and how we process information. And we're starting to see, and there's been some studies done on survivors and generations after the Holocaust that show that trauma has an impact on our DNA and RNA structures. It can, quote, reprogram those structures. We don't exactly know exactly what might trigger that, what's the severity of trauma that might trigger that. There's a lot of different ideas out there, and I'm really excited to read even more of the research as it comes out. But what we're talking about is that intergenerational trauma, especially something like slavery, was historic. And even though we don't have, quote, slavery today in the same form, I do think that we have some institutionalized levels of that. That's just my opinion. While we may not be actively engaged in slave trading per se, that historic trauma still impacts people to this day. It impacts the structures that people walk through on a day-to-day level. And if what we are seeing about DNA and RNA structures is correct, then it has altered the DNA of those descendants who are living today. And one of the most poignant moments, and I actually wrote about this on my blog on sharpsweetbella.com, about cultural humility, is that once when I was giving this presentation, someone brought up PTSD equals post-traumatic slave disorder, which I thought was just such a wonderful way to illustrate this exact example of intergenerational and cultural trauma. So we look at these cycles throughout our history and throughout our society where we are passing down trauma from one generation to the next. Humans experience and inflict trauma at an astonishing rate. Just look at these. I did not divide them into big T and little t trauma, because let's just get rid of that idea. I wanted to bring that up because these things all have very similar effects on the body. For example, natural disasters, if you are displaced by a tornado, if you're displaced by a hurricane, that can have a huge impact on you. Witnessing a violent crime obviously can have a massive impact. I said also forced displacement or separation, such as the kids at the border who are being separated from their parents. The trauma that those kids are going through just from the very virtue of being separated from their parents, such as in foster care placement, is really extraordinary. One of the statistics, and I need to find an updated version of this, but when I first started my career, we were working on a kinship placement bill that would prioritize family members for kiddos that are being taken out of the home and due to abuse or neglect. So that itself is also traumatic, right? That foster care placement, what I saw was a statistic that said for each placement, each time a kid is placed into a new home, their ability to attach in a healthy manner to an adult caregiver is reduced by 50%. And that's a really extraordinary impact on a young developing brain. One of the things I don't touch on as much in this presentation as I would like is a study about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and the impact that it has on the brain. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but I will put in a couple of show notes, one to a really excellent TED Talk about ACEs and how they impact our overall healthcare system. In terms of cost, in terms of adverse outcomes, all of those types of things. When kiddos grow up with trauma, it really impacts them. Terrorism and school violence is a reality for any kid that has gone to school from 1999 on. Including my own kids. And so being in lockdown because there was a domestic violence incident in the area is not uncommon for our kids these days. They don't get a context, they don't understand, and it is they believe and they perceive it as a threat to their security and bodily autonomy. So all of these things are going to have an impact on folks. And I'm very happy to talk about each and every single one of these, but I really wanted you to get a good sense for how broad trauma really is in terms of experiences. I believe all of us know someone. If we have not gone through one of these things ourselves, we know someone who has. So not to belabor the point a little bit, but multiple experiences of small t trauma, such as microaggressions, can have as much of an impact as a single experience of big T trauma. What matters most is how that person experienced it. And so, for example, when I talk about microaggressions, I'm talking, for example, about ableism and the inspiration porn that we will trot folks with a disability out and say, oh, look at how strong and how brave you are, for trying to be normal or something like that. That's a microaggression, and that's ableism. And while you might be able to withstand 1, 2, 3 instances, when it's happening every single day, it has that cumulative effect of getting into that trauma space. Trauma is also alarmingly common. Let's just talk about this for a moment. 70% of adults in the US have experienced some type of traumatic event at least once in their lives. I've seen a few estimates that estimate as high as 85%. Now, I will tell you that this was all pre-COVID. And I will tell you right now that COVID is going to be, it is a global traumatic experience. So this is something that all human beings, no matter where you live, no matter how well your country or your state handled COVID, you will have experienced some trauma, likely because of COVID. All of us have on some level or another. And this is also about folks who maybe define it as trauma. It may also depend on what examples they provided about trauma when they were doing some of this research. One thing I will say about the Me Too movement, for example, is that the Me Too movement suddenly woke up a bunch of people who are like, oh my God, I was accepting this kind of behavior at work and that was not okay. Wow, all what I've been feeling all this time, this hesitation or this withdrawal or, this anxiety is connected to that. So there's also, I think, a life cycle to when people actually choose to call it trauma as well, instead of, oh yeah, I just went through a thing. And I do think that changes and shifts over time, especially if you have not been re-traumatized by the event. You might be less likely to have viewed it as trauma until it starts popping back up again. It is no surprise that over 90% of those involved in behavioral health settings report at least one traumatic experience. And that could be like that big T stuff, that could be that little T stuff, it could be a combination of all of these things. And also no surprise to us who work in this industry, trauma is a risk factor in nearly all behavioral and substance use disorders. That is a really critical distinction to make and something that's really important to recognize for ourselves. The first, whenever I hear that someone is struggling with addiction, the very first thing that I think of is, I wonder what happened. Um, that is, I wonder what they are using the drugs to medicate for. In fact, so many of the disability applications that I have processed in the last 5 years that I've been doing this, where there is substance abuse, there is inevitably always a really grisly trauma background as well. And so if you start reframing substance abuse as I'm trying to medicate for something, then we have a much better way of a much better avenue to start addressing that addictive behavior, because we're actually trying to resolve the underlying trauma that it has been trying to heal and cover up. And lastly, there's a direct correlation between trauma and physical health conditions such as diabetes, COPD, heart disease, cancer, high blood pressure. That's not even counting things like depression, anxiety. It's not counting even things like ADHD. I know a lot of folks who have ADHD who have experienced a significant amount, especially of educational trauma around ADHD and the fear of rejection that comes along with that. So I don't think anything. I don't think it's fair for us to say that, to start distinguishing, oh, well, you had trauma, but you didn't have trauma. What trauma-informed care asks us to do is say, oh my gosh, so many people have gone through trauma, and whether or not you identify it as trauma, it's possible that you probably have gone through something. So let me alter, let me, the professional, let me, the person who is not experiencing the thing that you are right now, the trigger of this moment, let me adjust for you, because we recognize how alarmingly common trauma really is. So trauma, when people experience it and when they try to go back into the regular world after that experience, the body gets to be in constant survival mode. And this is when we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in ourselves and others. I am not a brain expert, I'm an attorney, but I will tell you that what I have learned about trauma over the years, what I have looked at in terms of the applications I have done, we talk a lot about the limbic system, about the lizard part of the brain. And that is really, it's that part of the brain that is trying to keep you safe. So it takes over in the middle of a traumatic event. You don't always get to choose your own responses in this. It tells the hippocampus what to remember. It shuts down some parts of the prefrontal cortex. So, which would be your logic and your reasoning skills, your planning, your executive functioning, all of that stuff, because it has switched on into survival mode. And then after the amygdala says, okay, guys, we're in emergency lockdown here, your hypothalamus then sends out all of these stress hormones throughout your body. And I have actually gotten to a point now where I can actually feel that that surge of adrenaline, that surge of cortisol, that surge of all of those hormones that are going to push me into action before I have a chance to think through the action. So, for example, I am a survivor of sexual assault, and I will say that probably my response during that was to freeze. I couldn't do anything. There was no other safe option for me. And so one of the things to keep in mind about this lizard brain is it's trying to keep that person safe. It's trying to keep you safe. And so it's going to lock down memories. It's going to lock down your ability to think through and reason, and it's going to perceive things very, very quickly, and it's going to make a split-second decision for you in a really big way. So what are some of the psychological impacts of this? So the amygdala becomes overreactive, and it's normally in charge of managing your emotions. And so your emotions can then go all over the map. Suddenly you start crying because, it's just in this hyper aroused state all the time. The hippocampus then starts to shrink, and that includes impaired memory. And one of the things that we talk about, for example, about why it's so hard to get justice for folks with sexual trauma, for example, is that your body is not remembering things. Your brain is not remembering things in the order in which it happened, which is what police or investigators often need in order to be able to prove a case. They need to create a chronology, they need to establish what the facts are. And the trauma brain might be remembering things in a very different sequence. It's not linear. It might be remembering that the abuser wore this specific cologne. It might be remembering that, this, that person was always drinking before they hit, but you might not remember the actual event itself or what was said during that event. So it takes a long time for the body to both access those memories and be able to articulate them. Shuts down speech, prefrontal cortex, impairs our executive functioning. So that's our planning, our judgment, our processing, our logical and rational mind. Cortisol gets overproduced, and so you then actually start getting activated kind of all the time. Anything that's even similar to that experience then starts activating that system all over again, because your brain remembers, oh my God, this is what happened last time I felt like this. And then it sets your body right back into motion because it thinks that it is in stress, and it thinks it's in threat mode as well. And then you get into this hypervigilance mode with that norepinephrine, where you're constantly looking over your back. You're constantly feeling like you have to be ready to move at any time to save yourself. And it all comes down to whether or not the brain feels safe. Here's some other common responses and symptoms of trauma. And I mean, these lists can really, really go on, and they need to be distinguished from PTSD. There's actually a lot of barriers to folks actually being able to be diagnosed with PTSD, and PTSD is much more of an ongoing sort of diagnosis, in terms of there's some very specific things there. But just because you don't qualify for PTSD doesn't mean that you didn't go through trauma, and doesn't mean that that trauma is not affecting you on some level or another. Some other things to look for is, these emotional signs of sadness or anger, shame and fear. A fear of the unknown, for example, is pretty common. Altered sleep patterns. So that could be patterns of nightmares. That could be, when I have been actively in this state, I can't sleep more than 4 hours in a night. When I've been actively in this state, I stop eating. I stop even recognizing my hunger signals altogether. You might get really sick to your stomach every time you walk into that school where you were bullied, even if you're just taking your kid to school. So all of those things can be very disruptive to people's lives, very disruptive to that person's life and the lives of the people around them as well. And this is not meant to guilt, this is meant to inform. Oh, let's talk about our trauma responses. I am actually not going to go through all of these in great detail, but I did want to touch on a few of them. And how this actually ends up working. This is a really great site, Complex Trauma Healing. They have a WordPress blog site, which is where I got this graphic from, and they have an Instagram that I think is also rather helpful too. And I love these infographics that they have, because it shows you how these different stress responses work on a continuum. Now, most of us have heard of fight or flight. Flight is that, pushing yourself into some other mode. And so if you are feeling really stressed out and unsafe at work, maybe that is triggering an overworking sort of thing where you're pouring yourself into work in order to help you feel more safe about work. You can be an adrenaline junkie. You're constantly busy. This is me. This is my go-to is flight most of the time when I'm stressed out. And It really, it starts down this road of obsession and perfectionism. And that's why when we talk about, whether or not someone responded to trauma correctly or not, did you fight back? Did you do this? We're not really helping anyone at all, because what we're really trying to say is, are you the perfect victim? Um, so what we want to do is we really want to understand that these are automatic responses. This is not something that you get to choose necessarily when you're in the moment. You might have a moment of, can I get away? You might think that. And if you can't get away, maybe your brain is going to go launching right into flight, an emotional flight where you disassociate. And so that is the same as getting away in that respect. Same thing for fight. Fight is a way, most of us have seen this, and we tend to view this, sorry, there's a trash truck outside. We tend to view this as aggressiveness, and we also tend to respect this particular stress response a lot more as a society than we do any of the others. At least if you fought back, then you tried to prevent this. Well, guess what, guys? Most victims cannot prevent their own trauma, especially in that moment, because again, we just talked about the brain and all the things, all the automatic things that the brain is doing. And that fight mode could also be preventative, meaning that if someone is, I'll use the work example for right now. If you're feeling unsafe at work, maybe you start getting really hyper aggressive and you start bullying your coworkers and bullying even your boss. I know I've experienced that. Even as a boss, being bullied by someone who is constantly in this fight mode. And you try to control the conversation, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to prevent actually ever feeling like that ever again, because trauma leaves you feeling very disempowered. You don't get a choice in A, how it happens to you, or B, how you respond when you're in the moment. So the folks who are on that fight end of that trauma response, they're trying to regain control on some sort of level. The other one that you probably have heard of is freeze. And that is where you just kind of go rigid and you hide, you isolate, you just stop whatever you're doing, kind of deer in headlights sort of response to potential re-traumatizing events. And freeze is also, someone referred to it once as the couch potato mode. And that is I can't motivate myself to get up, because you already anticipate all of the trauma that's going to happen once you start being active again. So the safest option that your brain is telling you is to just stay put and just stay still. And to avoid people and to disconnect, those last minute sort of cancellations for social events that you think might be traumatizing or triggering for you. And then lastly, this is one that we don't hear about enough, and I think it's incredibly relevant, especially in some of the world that we're living in right now, is this fawning response. And fawning is basically acquiescence. I am going to allow you to just do what you want to do. It is the merging with the wishes and the demands of the other party. And it is just as legitimate a response as fight, flight, or freeze. But I will tell you that that fawning response is very, very difficult to be able to overcome in court, for example. So for victims of a crime who sort of quote unquote allowed it to happen, which I hate that term, but I'm going to use it anyway because it's applied very often to the folks that are in this fawn response. And they tend to be people pleasers, doormats, whatever you want, ma'am, type of thing. And it's something that when you see folks doing that, start asking yourself, what is the stress that they're trying to avoid by doing that? These are all relevant questions. When we see people engaging in these behaviors, we really need to understand the fact that it's coming from a trauma from within. We may never know what that trauma was. We may never know what the source of that fear was, but it's coming from someplace very, very deep, and we need to look deeper rather than just labeling people, right? All right, moving on. Trauma in relationships. Of course, trauma is going to impact your relationships. And part of the reason why I'm bringing this up, especially for this particular seminar, is, you guys may not work in human services where you're dealing with people on a professional level who have been through trauma, but I will tell you right now that you are likely dealing with someone on a personal level who has been through trauma. Looking at those statistics of 70%, that's likely. It's very unlikely that you are partnered or have ever always been partnered with the 30% who didn't. And like I said, I'm not even sure about that statistic itself. So you can see the ways in which trauma impacts relationships. And remember, trauma disrupts that sense of safety, security, and bodily autonomy. Bodily autonomy in particular is so very important in our intimate partnerships, for example. And our family relationships. It's also really important in our friendships. Safety, security, bodily autonomy, all three of those things really matter. And you can see the ways in which people respond through trauma in their relationships. They might feel unlovable, guilty, or ashamed. So they don't ask for help. They anticipate danger or potential harm in new relationships. And so they're constantly guarding themselves. They're activated. They are, they put up that wall in front of you. They might isolate, withdraw, or feel like no one really understands them. And they fear abandonment and rejection because they know what it's like to be left on your own in a scary situation. And they know what it's like to have put your trust in someone and for that to have been violated on some level. And so in a lot of ways, and I actually see this, for example, with my son, they may reject you first in order to avoid future pain. I know I kind of do that. I will set a boundary with someone in a new friendship or relationship because I am afraid of that emotional abandonment and rejection as a part of my trauma. So what are triggering situations? Unfortunately, the word trigger has been co-opted from the very legitimate mental health world to describe a whole host of things, like I was triggered by that snowstorm, or snowflakes, to mock and belittle this particular type of reaction. But these reactions are actually very legitimate. General situations, I can't tell you what each person's specific trigger is going to be. Just looking at my own life, I can tell you that I tend to get triggered in situations where I feel isolated, where I feel overwhelmed, where there are a lot of confusing or overcomplicated steps that sets off that flight perfectionism in me, that I will keep myself safe if I can just be perfect, right? High conflict or threat situations. When I was a mediator, one of the whole reason actually I learned about trauma-informed care was to be a better mediator, because folks who are in mediation with me, they're in the midst of conflict. And that conflict can be super triggering, especially if they have a family history of violence that comes from that conflict. Other types of situations are going to be those where people feel disempowered. For example, you ask for accommodations for your disability in college. This is a pretty common occurrence. And you're told no. Well, you're being disempowered from being able to participate in the class to your full degree. And so you're already then triggering that trauma and that stress reaction. Likewise, one of the things I found with a lot of my clients was that the more unfamiliar a place was, the more unfamiliar a process was, the more unsafe it felt for them. And the less likely they were to engage in it. So one of the things I started doing with my clients, for example, is saying, hey, when you're applying for Social Security, sometimes you have to go to one of their doctors for them to examine you. Well, you don't get to choose who that doctor is. Even I, as the attorney, don't get to choose who that doctor is. And so often I would tell people, okay, we're going to meet at Dr. Brown's office. And Dr. Brown's office is over on the east side of Aurora. Um, and there's about 4 steps leading into the place. And there's an elevator if you need it, because, for example, that particular doctor was doing a lot of physical examinations. And so I, having fallen and hurt my back pretty severely 3 or 4 times in my life with severe back pain, I already know that in any situation, I'm wanting to know what sort of physical effort do I need to plan for in this. And that if I get there and it feels overwhelming, to navigate stairs that I didn't know were going to be there, to find the place, I'm going to get really activated into that stress mode. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to anticipate what could be a trigger for folks, these very big categories, and we're trying to work around those. But the big thing is for all of us to remember is that just because someone looks okay on the surface does not necessarily mean that they're okay on the inside. And another personal story, I recently left a job that I absolutely loved. I loved the job. I loved who I worked with. I loved who I worked for. And I loved the work that I was doing, but it was becoming so emotionally stressful for me to work there, because of the constant re-triggering that I was getting from my clients' cases, that I ended up being suicidal. And I'm going to be very blunt with you about that, for several months. And no one could tell on the surface. People knew I was stressed, but I was walking in with a smile on my face and cheerful and trying to look for the best in others. But when I came home, I was completely not present anymore. I was disassociating. I was really pouring myself into a lot of unhealthy habits in order to deal with the trauma that was happening and the stress that was happening day in and day out. So I did eventually leave that job, and that's actually why I'm doing this now, is because I really want to empower people to look out for one another. Even if someone's not okay on the surface, just even keeping your radar open for types of triggering situations and how people are responding to them can give you some insight. All right, so let's talk about changing the culture a little bit, because there's no doubt that I think all of us have heard of trauma. All of us have heard something about trauma. All of us know someone who's been through trauma, but we're doing a really poor job of taking care of each other, uh, in recovering and creating a world where we can recover from that trauma more easily and more effectively. Here are the guiding principles from SAMHSA, and I adapted these a little bit for less clinical settings, but the gist still remains. Trauma-informed care is these 6 principles when you are applying it. So this is the application phase of trauma-informed care. And so this is, the first one is physical and psychological safety. And I would also, for this crowd, for the One Heart, One Earth crowd, I would also include psychic and spiritual safety as well. Are we creating a safe environment for our loved ones? Are we creating a safe environment for our neighbors and our friends and our coworkers and our family members? Do we punish them if they tell us that they need help? Are we creating psychological harm by not being open to talking about trauma? So that goes along with this next one here of trustworthiness and transparency. Trustworthiness, I think, goes without saying that when you have been traumatized, your ability to trust future situations has already been proven to be inadequate, I will say. One thing about the difference that I feel between trauma and anxiety is I have a situation coming up. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm worrying about the future because I don't really have any facts and I don't really have an experience to rely on. And so my anxiety runs away from me sometimes in anticipating these new experiences. But when I have already experienced something and that situation comes up again, then now I have an experience to rely on that says, oh my God, this is traumatizing. You are not going to be safe in this situation. Even if that original trauma was a fluke, any situation that is similar to it, I am going to apply that same learning to it. So one of the responses in trauma-informed care is to create an environment of trust, is to do what you say and say what you're going to, say what you're going to do and then do what you say. Following through and being consistent, being transparent about the process, giving someone the full information that they need to make a good decision for themselves. Because one of the big pieces that's lost in trauma, and I said this before, is that choice and that ability to control your own outcomes, to control your own life. You didn't get a choice as to whether or not you were in that accident. You didn't get a choice as to whether or not that tornado came barreling down at your door. You don't have a choice as to what the rate of crime is in your neighborhood that you are dealing with on a daily level, or what you see on social media every day. So what we're trying to do with trauma-informed care is restore that trustworthiness and that transparency in other people, so that the person who was traumatized can start trusting themselves more as well. That includes providing loving support and connections. And so in the trauma-informed care world, we talk about peer support, which I think is one model of how we can do it. But loving support and connections, this means, is your support system actually supporting you? And are you actually supporting the person that you say you love? One great example was a former partner of mine who one day, when he was mad at someone who was also a sexual assault survivor, he made some really egregious comments like, they're usually lying or whatever else, fully knowing my history. So even what we tell other people about their own trauma, the people in our lives are watching us, and they're watching for whether or not they can feel safe with you with their trauma. And so even though he knew my history, the way that he was talking about other survivors really made me feel like I could no longer trust him, and that he wasn't actually supporting me whatsoever. So that loving support and those connections really, really matter. Who is in your life that is supporting you in this recovery? And are you actually truly providing the support that that person needs, if you were not the person who was traumatized? Likewise, collaborating as equals. So I call this leveling the playing field, right? All of us have these social dynamics of hierarchy that are just built into our culture, right? Boss to employee, doctor to patient. I could go into many, many more, teacher and student, and these are enforced hierarchies that we recognize as part of our societal framework. And what I propose that we do is that we equalize, we level that playing field as much as we possibly can. So recognizing that there's already a power differential between teacher and student, for example. So if I'm coaching someone, and I'll use that rather than our educational system, because that's a whole can of worms for a whole nother video. But if I'm coaching someone, there's already a power differential here. I have information, private information about them that they really don't have about me. I already have access to a lot of different resources and people. If they do something wrong, I could harm them out in the community. I could harm their reputation out in the community. If they are new to a community, I'm already established, I'm very well known, and I could be using that as power over them. And so what we really want to do is we want to preserve that sense of equality. We want to look at each single person as being a critical member of our decision-making process. Every person that we are dealing with on a personal level, we really need to do our due diligence to equalize that playing field as much as possible, because I don't get to decide what you do with your life when I'm coaching you. And so already, because I'm in this position, quote, of authority over you, I, as the person who is enjoying more privilege, I need to back it down just a little bit and ensure that you have enough room to feel empowered. Oh, and that brings us to our next one, which is empowerment. So what we really want to do, I mean, there's so many different ways that we could talk about empowerment, but empowerment at its core is, do you feel confident in making decisions for yourself? And so what we really want to do for folks who have been traumatized is we want to restore that sense of confidence, that sense of awareness, that sense um, of control over their own lives and choice over where their lives go. And so, for example, if I'm doing a social security application for someone, I could always set it up as, well, we don't have to do the application. So either you do it my way or we do it, or you just don't do it at all. That's called an ultimatum. And that's actually not very empowering. So instead, well, I'll always leave the option open that, hey, we also don't have to do this application right now. We don't have to do it today. We don't have to do it ever. And nor do you have to do it with me. But if I want someone to continue working with me, if I want someone to trust me, then I can also say, look, I really want to do this application with you. And it seems like you might be having a little bit of a bad day. So which would you rather do? That we work on the function report first or the work history report, or we just call it a day and maybe try another day? And so I leave those options open. So allowing someone to have choice, some individual choice in how they manage their day, how they manage their limited resources, their limited mental resources for coping is really, really critical. Lastly, cultural humility and responsiveness. In the social work world and mental health world, you'll often hear about cultural competency. I hate that term. And the reason I hate that term is competency sounds like it's something that you've achieved. You never have to do it again. I took one class, and so therefore I am culturally competent. No, sir. Uh-uh. No, you learned some stuff, and you now have to go out into the world and apply it. So cultural humility is this idea that I am constantly learning. I might have gone through a class about racial equality. That doesn't necessarily mean that I have all the tools I need to go out and change racial justice forever and ever. And that's exactly what we are hearing right now with Black Lives Matter is, there are so many people out there who say, oh, I'm so not racist. Well, that's not really culturally humble, is it? You're declaring yourself to be, instead of saying, you know what, I always have more to learn and I can see where my behavior has contributed to racism. My goodness. And so it's about being responsive and following through with that. There's a lot of distrust of, in particular, white allies right now, because there's a bunch of people who say, well, I have, I'm never racist. I'm the least racist person I know. You don't get to decide that. And part of cultural humility is recognizing that we don't get to declare ourselves the experts on someone else's culture. Oh, I love this hashtag relationship reboot. This is actually a really big part of what I do out in the world is I really try to re-engage and redefine how we work with each other. So some trauma-informed care best practices that also align with this idea of rebooting these old cultural messages that we have about relationships, whether it be relationships are competition, of monogamy. Relationships are, based in shame and guilt, guilting your husband into doing that project around the house. These things actually really have an impact on people and are not very trauma informed because they can actually make trauma much, much worse and keep that person in that level of activation. And what we don't want in our personal relationships is for someone to constantly feel on edge when they're around us. We want them to relax and to be themselves and to feel accepted and loved for who they are. So here are some ways we can do that. We can encourage and honor individual choice. Which would you rather do today? Go for a walk around the park or stay in and watch Netflix? That's a totally legitimate thing instead of saying, oh, we're going to go to the park today. Come on, and dragging your partner along. Let's not do that. Let's give them a little bit of choice so that they can decide how they want to spend that mental and physical energy for themselves. We don't get to decide that for them. Don't write or tell anyone else's story for them. What comes to mind, for example, is a video I saw recently where a cop was very upset that McDonald's, I think, screwed up her order, and she started in on this idea that they were punishing her because she was a cop. She had no evidence that that was actually the case. No one told her, well, we don't have your thing ready because you're a cop. You know, yeah, we can say that they're not going to say that, which is probably likely. But at the same time, we are also filling in a lot of blanks for each other with assumptions. And so this is a way to remind you that someone else's story is not yours to tell. So this goes at gossip, and this goes at assumptions. Don't gossip about people. Don't tell someone's story without their permission and without honoring the truth of that story. And likewise, don't fill in blanks about someone's story with some sort of concoction of your own. Now, there's an argument that says trauma-informed care is encouraging you to fill in those blanks. No, we are not filling in the story. All we're saying is it is possible. It is likely that the person across from me has been through something in their life. And I'm going to honor that. And I'm going to try to make this as easy for them as possible because they're carrying a burden I don't even know about. I don't even see or get to feel. So what we are doing is we're inviting that person to tell their story to us and to provide the trust that they need in order to be able to do that. Likewise, honesty and transparency create trust. Secrets help no one. If I hear one more time that everyone keeps secrets. Everyone keeps secrets because they don't feel safe telling those secrets to people. So in an intimate relationship, in a family, secrets can actually not only be harmful, but they can actually be fatal on a number of different levels. That secret of being in the closet, for example, could result in suicide later on down the line because they've never felt safe enough to feel loved. And instead of living with that secret, they chose not to live. It's a very difficult thing to talk about, but secrets are not trauma informed because it's not going toward that transparency and that trustworthiness that we're trying to inspire, nor are they safe. Even when we think we're keeping a secret to keep someone safe, for example, we're keeping a secret that, grandpa had another family before us, type of thing, and we're not going to tell anyone else. Well, when that family comes calling, when that grandpa dies, maybe that's going to be a time. So instead of making it a surprise, when you don't get to choose, telling a secret ahead of time, creating a safe space to receive that secret matters quite a bit. Likewise, people are the expert in their own experience. Don't give them unsolicited advice. Don't should all over them and tell them how they should live. You don't have to walk in their shoes. You might have been through something similar, but remember, you experienced it differently than they did. And one great way, my period was the source of a lot of stress for me, a lot of really, really difficult stress. And one thing that people always did is they always wanted to tell me what I should be using for birth control. You know what? I know what I feel in my body. I know the conversations I've had with my doctor. Stop imposing that on me. And over and over and over again, all it does is just remind me that I don't get to control my body and how it reacts to things, despite all of everyone else's ideas that I should be able to control my own pain in this way. So let's start eliminating should. When you feel yourself tempted to tell your partner, well, you really should be doing this, or you tell your kid, you really should be doing that, especially a grown-up kid, really check yourself because you're not walking in that person's shoes. You don't get to decide what is best for them. Be clear and consistent about your boundaries. Accept no for an answer. And so if that person is being clear with you about, I don't want to talk about this right now, continuing to push them and press them, guess what? That activates that stress response. And because what you have told them is that their boundary is not good enough and that you're going to violate that anyway. guess what that does? That re-traumatizes them. So we need to honor those boundaries. And likewise, when I'm listening to a friend or a family member who needs to talk about their trauma, and I'm at my limit for the day of what I can process before I go into my own stress response, I can say something along the lines of, you know what, I really, really want to be here for you today. I've had a bit of an overwhelming day and I want to be able to be present. Is there some way that maybe we can talk later tonight or tomorrow about this? Or is this something you need help with right now? Because if you need help, I'll see what I can do to help find help for you. That type of thing. So it's recognizing your own capacity and what you can do, what you're capable of doing, because don't overpromise and underdeliver. That also can create a sense of unsafety, unsafe, one of those words. Be present, be self-aware and open to learning. When you are spending time with that person, be present with them. Put the phone away, put the distractions away. Let them know that you're there for them. Even if it's only 10, 15 minutes, that is a critical way that you can help someone else, is just by being present with them and being open to hearing about their experiences instead of filling in the blanks for them. Listen non-judgmentally and respond without shame. I put those two together because they go together. But listen non-judgmentally is actually a part of mental health first aid, which I will put a link in the notes for you to sign up for a mental health first aid training. I recommend it for anyone, but in particular, anyone who is dealing with folks who are suffering with depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance abuse, schizophrenia. Oof, the list goes on. Personality disorders. It gives you a nice, good insight into that, a layman's insight and ways to respond. And one of those is listen non-judgmentally. Check your own body language, check the facial expressions that you get on your face. There was someone who had AIDS that I was working with, and he told me every time he needed an AIDS aware therapist, because every therapist he went to at this big mental health center that he mentioned that he had AIDS, they kind of did this where they kind of leaned back and, shut themselves off to him. And whether or not they approve, disapprove, whatnot, they are sending a very clear signal to him that him talking about his AIDS diagnosis is not going to be safe with that person. And so, we were able to get him to a better mental health center that specializes in that work, and where they talk very openly and directly about AIDS recovery. Likewise, stop the shame. My God, shame is such a poor motivator. Let's make people feel worse about themselves in order for them to become better people. Is really, really counterintuitive. And having struggled with more than my fair share of shame over the last several years, responding with shame, especially with the people that you love, I don't understand that. Why would you want to make someone feel worse about themselves? It is one thing to hold someone accountable, and I do talk about that later, but we can do that without shaming them for who they are and what they are experiencing or feeling at any given time. A really good example is the wife who tells her husband, "Oh, you're such a crybaby," whenever he starts getting emotional at a movie. First of all, let's encourage men to be emotional, to express emotions in healthy ways, like crying at a movie. But second of all, let's not shame them for something that is a response that they can't fully control, and that is not harming anyone. So name calling, shaming, things like that, those are big no-nos. Lastly, don't have anyone take long-term trips on the guilt bus. Communicate directly and patiently. None of this passive aggressive stuff where you start banging it around in the kitchen to make your partner feel guilty for not doing the dishes last night, where you are turning yourself into a martyr, and making everyone feel guilty for not appeasing you, that type of thing. And traumatized people do this as well. So I'm just saying this as a means of managing your own trauma too, and your own trauma reactions. Communicate very directly. Say, this is what I need. It's not uncommon for me to go to my partner and say, I really need some reassurance right now. I'm feeling really insecure about this presentation. Can you give me a little bit of reassurance? Because instead of me kind of hemming and hawing and dropping hints and things like that, I'm just asking for what I need very, very directly. All right. Finally, building a new earth. Let's resist re-traumatization. So that is my wish. When we talk about building a new earth and creating a space for humanity, this 5D reality, at the very least, can we have a world where we are not at least re-traumatizing each other, much less traumatizing each other? We talked about how common trauma is, but what's even worse is the level to which we do this re-traumatization, and that relationship reboot applies right here too. Most trauma is actually avoidable, and by avoidable, I mean by the people who have inflicted it. Uh, Not necessarily the people who have experienced it. The person who is going through poverty right now, who is living in the midst of community violence, they can't prevent that, but we can. And we can prevent how we re-traumatize that person after knowing that they have been through these things. The biggest thing that we can do, a little quote here from me, is the compassionate recognition of each other's internalized pain and struggle. If we can just see each other for the legitimate human people that we really are, the human reactions that we have, the better able we are to deal with, to create a world that feels safer, feels more secure, and honors that bodily and spiritual autonomy. So, quick definition of what is re-traumatization: a conscious or unconscious reminder of past trauma that results in a re-experiencing of the initial traumatic event. Now, there's a related idea about vicarious trauma, and that's hearing about someone else's trauma and you having a traumatic effect on you from hearing or reading about someone or watching someone else's trauma. I think a lot of us felt that vicarious trauma when we watched the George Floyd video. And when we have watched subsequent videos of violence where someone has been severely abused, we would likely feel vicarious trauma, but that's different than re-traumatization, which is the person who has been through trauma then is re-experiencing and part of that event on some level or another. And I don't mean it like an official flashback, but just a reminder, just a poke at them like, hey, remember this really awful thing that happened to you like 20 years ago? I'm going to remind you about that right now. And so the least that we could do as a society is try to avoid situations where we're re-traumatizing others without their consent. I don't know anyone who would consent to being re-traumatized, but at least let them have the choice in that, right? So here are some examples. A situation is a situation could be threatening to leave if they don't comply. Ultimatums can actually be rather re-traumatizing for a number of people, especially if they grew up in abusive households, which was either you do it my way or you can leave. Especially for our queer and transgender youth who have been displaced from their homes and rejected by their families. And so when we are in relationship or friendship with them later on, and we say, either you go to therapy or I'm out of here, we are setting up literally the same situation that they were just in. Either you deny who you are, or you're going to lose my love. So let's be mindful of that. Likewise, attitudes and expressions, statements about shame that shame survivors of sexual assault, for example. I gave you that example of a prior partner of mine who, was talking smack about another survivor. Well, already that's re-traumatizing me because he's echoing all the same things that have been going through my mind about my own experience, or all the ways in which I have been doubting myself and blaming myself for my own experience. So don't give voice to the devils inside our heads, and the stuff that is preventing us from actually recovering. Likewise, an environment. The partner's cologne is the same that the abusive ex wore. I actually had to mediate a divorce about that, where actually the mother in the case wanted to just ask that he not wear a certain cologne when he's doing drop off. That had actually been an issue throughout their whole marriage. She had been raped before. He didn't believe her. He kept wearing the cologne, even though she said it was giving her nightmares, it was triggering her, and that was actually the reason why they divorced. See, that can actually be a problem. So think of it this way. This quote from one of my former clients, who I call Nadine here: if I don't feel safe, 90% of my effort will be put toward ensuring my safety in this situation. So that means 90% of their brain, 90% of their energy, 90% of their physical body and energy and cell structure and everything is getting devoted to just keeping themselves safe at a minimum in these situations. So the more that we can reduce the incidence of re-traumatization for folks, the easier it's going to be for us to help them feel safe so that they can really work within their full potential with us, whether it's parent and child, partners, friends, social networks, whatever. Let's recognize when we are causing people to feel unsafe. Finally, accountability, I believe, is an act of love. And so I'm not saying that when someone has been through trauma that we don't hold them accountable for the bad behavior, for the ways in which they are just screaming at us or lashing out at us because, you know, they might have been re-traumatized earlier in the day by something else that happened. Nor are we saying that we should not be held accountable when we are re-traumatizing someone else. Accountability, there was a really wonderful session in this summit about empaths and how accountability calls us to live to our highest self and to bring us back to this promise of our higher self. You know, we're all human. All of us are human, and all of us are going to make mistakes. But what we really need to do when we are holding someone accountable, when we're calling someone in to live up to their full self and the highest potential for themselves, what we are doing is we are recognizing that shame is a poor motivator. There are times and places where calling someone out publicly is warranted, and I can do a different presentation on that some other day. But overall, we recognize, especially with the people that we love, that shame is a very poor motivator. And in fact, it's going to usually trigger that freeze response in someone where they're not going to move forward because they are so ashamed of themselves because we've locked them down onto that couch with so much shame and guilt that they're never going to get back up again. Likewise, when we're calling someone in, it's best to ask questions rather than assume. And so the best way to do that for me when I'm looking at it and thinking of a situation, someone said something racist. A friend said something racist on Facebook the other day. I could call them out and I could say, that was really racist. How dare you? Blah, 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 blah. I could do that. And I certainly have in the past. Or I could say, you know, I'm not sure if you realize, but you know, I really feel like this was racist. What was, you know, this statement, what did you mean by this statement? That's another way that you can get at that, and you can help lead them to the conclusion of, oh my God, that was racist. Oh my God, I didn't even realize that. Or, you know, hey, did you realize that that statement could have been perceived as racist? Can we talk a little bit more about that? And just doing that instead of assuming that that person is intending to show that level of hate. There are a number of people who still don't understand, and we want them to understand. We want to invite them in to understand, to be their highest self, and to be accountable for their words and actions. We don't want to cut that off. Likewise, when we start to go down a road of dehumanizing, and so that could include fat shaming, that could include ableism, that could include name calling, that could include saying that someone should just go kill themselves and you're not even a real man type of thing, you know, all of those types of things. When we are dehumanizing, we are missing the point about trauma-informed care. Dehumanization, remember, we are treating people as equals. Dehumanization creates that power differential between people. I, here on high, am judging you down below for how awful you are. And I am going to make fun of you. I'm going to use my power against you. I am going to whip you down. And that is not the best way to resolve things, right? If you want to tear it down, if you want to tear down that relationship, if you want to tear that person down, that's your business, but it is not going to be trauma informed. Likewise, trauma-informed care, when we are looking at accountability, we are looking at leaving an avenue for redemption. What is the avenue for redemption? How does this person make things right? And that really needs to be the question that we ask in our legal systems, is how can I make this right? And we do this all the time as lawyers when we are crafting settlement agreements. Sometimes money is going to make it right. Sometimes change behavior is going to make it right. And sometimes, sometimes every now and then, an apology will just make it right. And that really matters to understand what it is that you need in order to feel whole and in order to feel like this person has been held accountable. And I think that's one of the major problems that a lot of people have with the current environment is they feel like we are just passing judgment without any means by which for people to show that they've done better over these years. And that's just something that I would encourage all of us to do in our daily lives, because ultimately what we don't want to create is two separate societies. One society that always gets it wrong and, you know, we should just give up on them, and another society that always gets it right and we should always believe in them. All of us deserve to be on a level playing field. And so I use this quote a lot when I'm talking to managers, when I'm doing my training, is feedback without empathy is just humiliation disguised as help. So just remember that when you are giving feedback to someone, let's avoid the humiliation, because humiliation will put someone on the defensive. It will trigger that retraumatization. Who does not have the experience of being humiliated, right? For me, that can be a very traumatic situation. There was a very traumatic moment where I was outed to the entire world without my consent. And that was humiliating for me. And they did it as a means of punishing me for my agenda, which they got wrong. So just something to remember and just something to keep in mind. Do not do more harm with with holding someone accountable than the person actually did. All right. Other things that we can do to create a better earth is we can believe survivors. I know we live in a world, and specifically in a nation, that has a legal system of guilty until proven innocent. But the reason why we have guilty until proven innocent is that we recognize that the guilt, especially criminal guilt, will deprive someone of their life on some level or another. It will put them in jail. It will add to their record, whatever. That does not necessarily mean that you, as the owner of a club, or as the president of a sports association, do not, have to have the exact same standards. Membership in your organization is not a matter of life, liberty, or death. Right? They can go make their own organization. They can go make their own club. They can go join some other club. But we choose to believe survivors. So we're going to keep this. We are putting people on notice already that if you hurt someone else, that's a problem for us. And that's what we do when we communicate that we believe survivors. And I know that could be a pretty controversial statement, so I'm very happy to discuss that later. But that actually, that statement of believing survivors is the advice that I've gotten from law enforcement officials throughout the state, especially when we're talking about marginalized communities responding to abuse. Likewise, reduce the triggering events and commentary. Just recognize when you are creating that situation and try to stop yourself, or try to take some ownership of that. Like, I'm so sorry, I was not trying to make this an unsafe place for you. That's the first question we should be asking someone, is what do you need to feel safe in this situation? Be present, limit distractions. We talked about that before. Stay person-centered and inclusive with your language. You notice that I talked about people struggling with addiction. People who are struggling with addiction, not addicts. We move away from the labeling of other people. That's another way to dehumanize them. That's another way to say, yeah, your story doesn't matter. I've already decided what your story is. Eliminate shaming responses. So important that I put it in bold. I don't think I need to say more about that because I've talked about that pretty consistently throughout this. But I really, really, really cannot tell you how much shame limits our ability to really connect with each other. Input into one's own destiny. Let's try to preserve that. Don't try to tell someone exactly what they should do with their lives, where they should go with their lives. Let them be in charge of their own story and let them be in charge of their own destiny. And that includes in marriages. God only knows I have mediated enough situations where one partner made a unilateral financial decision, such as in one extreme example, buying a very expensive Tesla with their entire savings, leaving them with no money to send their kids to college, for example. That can be re-traumatizing for someone who has been through financial abuse by a partner who wouldn't let them have input into their own spending, into their own finances, would not let them even have information about that. I've dealt with that on a number of levels. So if you love someone, let them have some input into things that impact them. That matters. We also need to do the really hard work of evaluating our own pain. How often are we imposing not only just trauma on other people, but our trauma on other people? How often are we lashing out because we feel unsafe? How often are we shaming someone because someone shamed us? So really, it all comes down to really being honest with yourself about your own pain and dealing with your own shadow. I know that we've talked about that a lot. I've talked about that during my tower presentation about dealing with our own pain and our own shadow. That is such critical work if we are going to build a new earth. And that, along with that, is holding yourself accountable. So for example, a few weeks ago, I had a really big breakdown because I realized, oh my gosh, I have been talking over all of these Black women who are trying to let me know that I'm talking over them and I'm taking up, too much of their space. Let them talk for themselves. And I could have made it all about me, and I could have centered myself, or I could hold myself accountable, and I could demonstrate the type of accountability I am expecting from others. Recognize when you are making the process more important than the person. This is especially true in your work life. How often do we prioritize the process? Going to HR and filling out this form. No, I'm not going to listen to you unless you have this form. How often are we imposing those types of requirements on people when we really don't need to? Maybe someone comes into us, they mention something, and we write a note about it, and we offer the form afterward. Put the person first whenever we can. There are some times that we don't have any say in the process. But when we do, let's see if we can put the person first instead of the process. Finally, learn how to apologize without qualifiers. What do I mean by that? I mean, learn how to say, I'm sorry, without saying, I'm sorry if you felt harmed by that. I'm sorry that you felt offended. I'm sorry that you misunderstood me is one of my favorites that I see all the time, especially when someone's responding to me. I'm sorry that you misunderstood me. No. I'm sorry. I think we have a misunderstanding. Isn't one way to say it. Would it be okay if I try to explain some more? I'm sorry that I hurt you. It's a fact that you hurt them. Okay, you don't get to decide how someone else feels about how they received your actions and words. You know that you may not have intended it to hurt, But that in itself and saying, oh, well, I didn't mean it that way, is not an apology either. You said something that was harmful, whether you intended it to be harmful or not. I am sorry I said something that was really harmful to you. Do you mind if we talk about it so that I learn how to not do it again? Is a really wonderful way to make that work. And I will say, as a mediator, I'd say about 70% of my cases, all that people really wanted was an apology. And I will tell you that the legal profession makes it incredibly difficult to get the legal profession, and the insurance profession make it very, very difficult to ever truly say you're sorry without those qualifiers. I think, unfortunately, my profession has trained us all to anticipate a lawsuit. And so instead of just saying, I'm sorry that you got hurt, I'm sorry I was responsible for your hurt, is a really, really difficult thing for us to do culturally. So in the new earth, I want us to be able to apologize without qualifiers, and for that to be okay and to be acceptable. All right, so just a few things before we wrap up. If you felt that this training was helpful for you, this is part of what I do as a heart-centered leader. This is another hashtag that I use, of radiant resilience. When I see heart-centered leaders out there who have been through their own trauma, have been able to work through it, to recover from it, and are guarding themselves against future re-traumatization, and even better, helping to guard others from re-traumatization. That's the kind of heart-centered leadership we actually do need in the world. We need people who are going to be honest with themselves and with each other about the pain that we have been through as a society. So I do offer training for groups and individuals. I offer heart-centered coaching for those who want to leverage themselves into leadership positions, either leading the new earth or leading your organization or creating your own organizations. I really want us to step up as leaders who have this heart-centered approach. And likewise, I also do consulting for organizations that are already established and out there on how they can become more trauma-informed or more heart-centered, or both, so that we can start creating policy. And part of the reason I wanted to do this, my goal and my passion is heart-centered leadership, as well as trauma-informed social change, and in particular trauma-informed public policy. So my particular crux is making sure that the rules and the laws that we write do not act to re-traumatize people. So again, it's putting the person over the process in the way that we draft our laws. That is why I went to law school. I really hate courtrooms. Courtrooms are actually kind of traumatizing for me, and I have major anxiety attacks every time I walk into a courtroom, even if it's just to say hi to one of the attorneys I know who might be in the room. I always get really nervous. So I went down this route with my consulting to bring us much better trauma-informed public policy. So with that, I also do grant writing, I do program design and implementation, I do program evaluation, especially for folks in the human services world, and in the legal world as well. So if any of those opportunities are of interest to you or someone you know, please pass along my information, and please ignore all of the sounds I have going in the background, because guess what? How I deal with stuff is with fidget toys, and what you hear is a ball bearing that keeps falling out of this silly fidget toy that I have. So here's how you can contact me. I'll leave all of these links in the show notes as well, but you can contact me email. I just launched my website today, so I'm very proud of it. There's more coming to the website, but for right now, it gives you a lowdown on who I am, a little bit more of my bio and my accomplishments. You can also find me at Sharp State Bella on Instagram and Twitter. That's pretty much my main handles. I'm on Facebook, but not very often. So find me however you can. If this training was useful to you, if you have feedback about this training, I'm always very welcome to accept constructive feedback. If you say it sucked, that doesn't really help me. So if you say, hey, that slide is actually missing information about this, that's much more helpful for me so that I can adapt and improve myself. So thank you so much for being part of this summit, and thank you so much for listening to me during this time. Um, Please find me wherever you can. I hope that you are all active and well and really utilizing the tools at your disposal to create a new earth. Thank you so much. All right, let's stop sharing this and we will stop the recording. Have a wonderful day.